Good afternoon and welcome to the Federal Railroad Administration's Section 106 Basics for Potential FRA Grantees webinar. Before we begin, I would like to take you through the items you see on your screen. The PowerPoint presentation for the webinar appears in the top left window of your dashboard. If you're having problems viewing the presentation slides, ensure that you are not using a web browser to view the webinar. If you are, exit the webinar and re-enter the webinar through the Adobe Connect desktop application. Today's presenters are Deputy Federal Preservation Officer Amanda Murphy and Federal Preservation Officer Catherine Zerang from the Environment and Project Engineering Division at FRA. I will now hand things off to Amanda Murphy to start the webinar. Amanda?
Thank you. Welcome. This is a basic general overview of the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 process for potential FRA grantees. This webinar is not going to make you an expert in Section 106 or answer specific project questions, but we will answer the who, what, where, why, when, and how FRA conducts Section 106 reviews. Concepts will build upon one another throughout the webinar, so concepts introduced early may be explained more in depth later on in the presentation. As explained, the Q&A will be based on questions submitted during registration and questions submitted in the chat box during the webinar. The webinar will be recorded and posted to the FRA website for independent viewing after today. And as some attendees have asked, no certificates will be issued for this training. The webinar will give you an idea of what the Section 106 process is, how it is completed, why it is relevant to FRA grants or other projects where FRA is involved, the potential time and cost implications on your project, and how grantees or project sponsors can work in coordination with FRA to complete the Section 106 process as quickly and efficiently as possible. Just a note, while generally a grantee refers to a project sponsor who receives grant monies from FRA, FRA also works with other project sponsors to issue safety approvals or other project approvals that do not involve grant funding. Please note that these terms may be used interchangeably throughout the presentation and that information contained in this webinar is applicable to both grantees and project sponsors. In this first section, I will explain what is Section 106 and why does FRA need to comply with Section 106. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires federal agencies to consider the effects of their actions, also known as undertakings, on historic properties. For FRA, this means Section 106 must be complete prior to grant obligation and/or implementation of a project. Two critical Section 106 concepts. What is an undertaking and what are historic properties? An undertaking is any project, activity, or program funded by a federal agency, carried out with federal financial assistance, or requiring a federal permit, license, or approval. For FRA, this most often means providing grant or loan funding for a project or approving a new safety regulation. A historic property is any prehistoric or historic district, site, building, structure, or object included in or eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. Generally, a property must be at least 50 years of age or older to be considered historic, but there are some exceptions to this. On this slide, you will see some examples of historic properties. They can be historic district sites, buildings, structures, or objects. They can be related to the railroad or not. Because our nation's railroads date back to the early 1800s and are historically important in many ways, historic properties can include, but are not limited to, railroad infrastructure, such as bridges, tunnels, culverts, passenger stations, operations buildings, as well as segments of the railroad line. Section 106 follows a decision-making process established in 36 CFR 800 and is one of the several federal environmental review requirements under the Nepa umbrella. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA for short, is often referred to as an umbrella law because the process, which must be completed before grant obligation, requires federal agencies to comply with executive orders in specific environmental resource laws, such as Section 106. This graphic shows the other environmental laws that fall under the NEPA umbrella. NEPA sets up a process for federal agencies to consider the impacts of their action on the human environment. The human environment consists of both the natural and physical environment, such as historic and cultural properties, and the relationship of people with that environment. Note that while every federal agency must comply with the same laws, each agency, including those within DOT, might have different procedures on how to do this. In this next section, I'm going to explain where Section 106 falls into an FRA grant lifecycle and when the process should begin. Most of the Section 106 process takes place during the award or obligation phase of a grant and is generally referred to as environmental review. However, there are things that you can do during pre-award in your grant application to help facilitate the Section 106 process. Also, if your project has adverse effects to historic properties, you will have to implement mitigation requirements after your project is awarded. Both of these points will be addressed later in the presentation. As explained, if FRA issues grant funding or has an approval action for your project must comply with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act and NEPA. Generally referred to as environmental review, the documentation to demonstrate compliance with these laws is completed during the award phase in a grant life cycle, highlighted in yellow here on the screen. The environmental review documentation must be completed before FRA can obligate your grant. Beginning the environmental review early is critical, especially if your project has statutory deadlines. Section 106 can take anywhere from 1 month to 1 year or more, depending on the effects your project may have on historic properties. You should also begin thinking about your project's potential effects on historic properties early in project development. 2 common misunderstandings related to environmental reviews. The level of effort to document compliance with NEPA does not necessarily equate to the level of effort required to document compliance with Section 106. For example, if your project qualifies for a categorical exclusion, the minimal level of documentation under NEPA, it still may require extensive surveys, consultation, and mitigation commitments under Section 106. Another misconception: if FRA or another federal agency or state DOT authorized to act on behalf of a federal agency does not provide funds, permits, licenses, or approvals for your project, it is not subject to NEPA or Section 106. The trigger is that there is a federal action involved with your project. In this section, I'm going to explain how FRA conducts Section 106 reviews and what information does FRA need to complete a Section 106 review. Section 106 is a 4-step process. The federal regulations that outline this process can be found in 36 CFR Part 800, known as the Protection of Historic Properties. The first step is to define the FRA's undertaking and to initiate Section 106 consultation. The second step is to define the geographic area where project activities may affect above and below ground historic resources, known as the area of potential effects, and then identify historic properties that fall within that boundary. The third step is to determine if the project would affect any of the identified historic properties. If adverse effects are anticipated, the fourth step is to resolve those adverse effects. Similar to NEPA, Section 106 does not dictate a specific outcome such that historic properties must be preserved. However, measures that might avoid or minimize adverse effects must be considered. If you think early on in project development that your project is likely to have adverse effect on historic properties, it may be worthwhile to incorporate avoidance or minimization measures into your project scope to minimize the time delays and additional project costs. The regulations at 36 CFR 800 specify a number of entities that may be involved with your project's Section 106 review. This may include FRA and you as the grantee or the project sponsor. It may also involve a state or tribal historic preservation officer, federally recognized Indian tribes, and consulting parties who have a demonstrated interest in historic properties involved with the project. It can also involve the public. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the federal agency that wrote the Section 106 regulations, may also be involved if there are adverse effects. Who is involved and their level of involvement will depend upon your project, the number and types of historic properties affected, and whether your project will result in adverse effects. Engagement with these different groups can involve notification, review and comment upon Section 106 materials, such as cultural resources reports or design plans, concurrence with FRA determinations of eligibility or effect, and public comment periods. If your project is receiving federal funding or approval, a Section 106 subject matter expert at FRA will help you determine and direct an appropriate strategy for engaging these important stakeholders. During the second step of the Section 106 process, an area of potential effect, or APE, must be established. APEs are defined both horizontally and vertically. An APE needs to account both for direct and indirect effects. In this graphic on the screen, the red line equals the area that you would have direct effects, and the yellow are the indirect effect areas. And they also might include temporary and permanent effects resulting from your project. The APE is not necessarily confined to the rail right-of-way and will be unique for every project. APEs need to account for the entirety of your project, including the primary work site, as well as temporary work areas that support the completion of the project, including the creation of access roads, staging areas, construction pads, just to name a few. There are certain questions that a grantee should answer for FRA to help define the APE. Where will ground disturbing activities take place? What needs to be demolished, cut down, destroyed in order to build or operate your project? How far away can your project be seen? This will vary from project area to project area, depending on buildings, vegetation, and other things that might shield your project from view. How far away will construction be heard or felt? Are there historic districts adjacent to your project? Some common mistakes that we see in the Section 106 review process are that grantees or project sponsors do not define an APE at all, that they do not account for temporary areas used to support the construction activities, and do not account for view sheds, the geographical area visible from a project location or potential noise and vibration. Once you define your APE, share this with FRA and explain the methodology you used to define these boundaries. Make sure you consider all of your project scope activities, both during construction and operation. When FRA approves the APE, next you need to identify historic properties within it. Historic properties are district sites, buildings, structures, and objects significant in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture that are listed or eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. This significance can be at the local, state, or national level. There are specific criteria that resources must meet in order to be historic properties listed or eligible for listing in the National Register. Through the Section 106 process, FRA and the project sponsors are responsible for identifying historic properties in the area of potential effect. That means that there could be previously unidentified historic resources that meet the National Register criteria. This step is completed through consultation process between FRA and a state historic preservation officer, which we also refer to short as a SHPO, or a tribal historic preservation officer if your project is on tribal land, and must be completed with the assistance of the project sponsor. The determination as to whether a property is eligible for the National Register is part of the identification process of Section 106. NPS eligibility criterion considerations are shown on this slide. In order to be considered eligible, the resource must both retain integrity and be important in one of at least 4 categories: events, persons, architecture or design, and archaeology. Due to the age of railroads, there are many examples of railroads and rail infrastructure that are listed or eligible for listing in the National Register. While archaeological remains of railroad infrastructure are not generally accounted for on encountered on most projects, railroad infrastructure may still affect archaeological resources unrelated to the railroad, such as prehistoric or historic sites that predate the railroad, including those that have significance to tribes, such as burials or habitation sites. These must still be considered during the Section 106 review process. Grantees need to provide certain information to FRA to support the identification and evaluation of historic properties. What resources are already listed in the National Register? What resources do the SHPO have listed or eligible in their records? What resources are 45 years of age or older? Do you have records that show previous ground disturbance or modifications within your project area? Do you have any cultural resource reports for your project or previous projects in the area? Do you have an archaeological report for your project or previous projects in the area? One thing to note is that while the NPS criteria for a historic property is generally 50 years of age or older, FRA defaults to considering properties that are 45 years of age or older in order to provide a little bit of wiggle room between project award and construction. Otherwise, Section 106 may be obsolete by the time you actually put a shovel in the ground for your project. This is a common practice amongst federal agencies to create efficiencies in the review process. A common mistake that we see in this identification and evaluation step is archaeological considerations, including underwater archaeology, are not appropriately accounted for. This is especially prevalent in areas of new or greenfield construction or where in-water work will occur. FRA needs supporting documentation to demonstrate that the area is previously disturbed or does not contain archaeological resources eligible for the National Register. If after going through this identification process, FRA finds there are no historic properties in your area of potential effect and the State Historic Preservation Officer concurs with this finding, the Section 106 process is complete for you. However, if there are historic properties in your APE, you must determine if your project will affect them. Effects are defined as any alteration to the characteristics of a historic property that qualify it for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. Effects may diminish the integrity of a property's location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, or association. They can be direct, such as the demolition of a structure or a ground disturbance, or they can be indirect, such as the loss of structural integrity due to vibration or the introduction of new visual elements that do not previously exist. They can also be adverse or not adverse. If a project affects properties in a negative way to the point where they would not qualify for inclusion in the National Register anymore, then they are considered to be adverse effects. If the project activities don't compromise the integrity of the historic property, then they are considered not adverse. In an overly simplified manner, if an individual were to come to a site 6 months later and they didn't notice a dramatic change in the property's appearance, then this probably would probably not constitute an adverse effect. Grantees should consider if their project will involve any of the activities listed here, as they may cause adverse effects to historic properties. On this slide, you will see some of examples of projects that had no adverse effects. Those are the ones on the left-hand side of your screen, and that's because they restored the historic property or they used in-kind materials and methods to reconstruct a historic structure. The examples on the right show adverse effects because they demolished a historic property or altered the building and removed its character-defining features. If FRA determines your project has no adverse effect on historic properties, and the SHPO concurs with no objection from consulting parties, your Section 106 review is completed. However, if FRA makes a determination of adverse effect, the adverse effect needs to be resolved and mitigated. This is usually done through the negotiation and execution of a Section 106 agreement document. There are two types of agreement documents: a memorandum of agreement, or MOA, and it's generally used when we know how to mitigate the adverse effect at the time of that we're preparing this information. A programmatic agreement is used generally for larger projects where it's more likely that all the historic properties or effects might not yet be known. The agreement document and the mitigative resolutions captured in it are developed in consultation with the State Historic Preservation Officer, tribes, and other consulting parties, and sometimes the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Once the agreement document is finalized and executed, Section 106 is complete and the NEPA decision document is finalized. Section 106 agreement documents are legally binding, and the project sponsor is responsible for completing mitigations set forth in the MOA or PA after obligation of the grant. We've just discussed what the standard Section 106 review entails. Now we're going to talk a little bit about an alternate streamlined way in which compliance with Section 106 might be achieved for projects within railroad right-of-way. On August 17, 2018, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation issued the program comment to exempt consideration of effects to rail properties within rail rights-of-way. In short, we call it the program comment, and it can be used by any federal agency that has a project within railroad right-of-way. A wide variety of repair, maintenance, and upgrade activities are exempt from Section 106 review under the program comment for rail right-of-way. However, entire rail lines and the nation's rail network are not exempt like the highways. The program comment applies to activities that are federal undertakings, affect rail properties, and are located within existing rail right-of-way, either part or full, and are also located within disturbed portions of rail right-of-way. If your property has never been evaluated for the National Register of Historic Places and it's suspected to be 45 years or older, it may be a time savings measure to assume the property is historic, but the project sponsor may be required to follow certain conditions, such as the use of in-kind materials or using Secretary of Interior qualified personnel when you're handling your project. We'll have more on that when a Secretary of Interior qualified professional is later on in the presentation. In other instances, it also may be more advantageous to complete a standard Section 106 review if the program comment conditions are not warranted. You should look at this on a case-by-case basis, and FRA will assist in deciding the best approach to take with regard to Section 106 compliance. The program comment allows for flexibility in determining when to apply the program comment to a project that has already been initiated. However, if Section 106 process is already underway and has been involved extensive stakeholders and consulting party outreach, or resulted in conditions agreed upon by the SHPO and the project sponsor, FRA may, at its discretion, decide to complete the standard Section 106 process rather than invoke the program comment. If there are other program alternatives or agreement documents that would apply to your project, the program comment allows FRA to determine which to apply. The program comment does not necessarily take precedent on these other streamlining measures. There are a total of 95 exempted activities in the program comment and 13 categories of actions shown here on the screen. From September 2018 to January 2022, FRA was able to apply the program comment to 37% of the projects for which Section 106 consultation would have been required. There are numerous types of projects that the program comment cannot be used on. These include demolition and replacement of railroad bridges, repair rehabilitation of bridges that do not follow specified criteria in the exempted activities list. Examples of this are a change in super or substructure material from timber to concrete, or projects that are located outside of existing railroad right-of-way, such as rail line relocations. When the program comment cannot be used to a specific element of your scope of work or non-rail related historic property, such as archaeological sites or non-rail related historic districts that may be affected by your project, then normal Section 106 review is required. Again, it is possible that FRA determines that parts of your project may be covered by the program comment. If that's the case, the scope of your standard Section 106 review would be narrowed to those historic properties and or activities that are not covered under the program comment. If you want to become more familiar with the program comment, FRA held a webinar specifically on the program comment in December of 2018. We encourage you to view that webinar as well as materials related to the program comment on FRA's website. Access links are provided in the web resources box on your screen. They also will be provided after today's webinar. Now it's time for some poll questions.
Thanks, Amanda. All right, so our first poll question is, compliance with Section 106 is a critical pathway and can impact the timeline for my project's grant obligation. A, true. B, false. You can easily just make your selection by hitting that little circle either next to A or next to B. All right, just a few more seconds and then we'll end this poll or end this question. All right, the answer there was true. All right, our next question is, historic properties subject to Section 106 are generally at least 50 years old and can include railroad infrastructure such as bridges and tunnels, as well as segments of rail line. A, true, or B, false? All right, we'll wrap this question up. Thank you all so much. And the answer was true. And for this segment, our final question is, the Section 106 program comment for rail right-of-way exempted activities applies to A, demolition or replacement of railroad bridges, B, routine repairs or maintenance of existing rail infrastructure to keep railroads operating safely and efficiently, C, acquisition of property to construct new rail line, D, construction of a new passenger station. And we'll give this question just a few seconds more. All right, and the answer for that was B, routine repairs or maintenance of existing rail infrastructure to keep railroads operating safely and efficiently. Amanda, back to you.
Thank you. You guys did great on that. Some of the questions had near 100% correct answers. I did want to provide a little bit of clarification for polling question number 2, which was historic properties subject to Section 106 are generally at least 45 years, at least 50 years old, and can include railroad infrastructure such as bridges, tunnels, and segments of the railroad. So the general National Register criteria is that a historic property is at least 50 years old unless it's exceptionally significant. But the difference that I explained was that FRA uses 45 years just because our projects can take a bit of time to actually construct through the grant process. So the standard is 50, but FRA uses 45 years in age like a lot of federal agencies do. So in the next section, I'm going to explain what types of information you can provide to FRA in a grant application to help the Section 106 process go more smoothly. When FRA reviews a grant application, one of the things we look for is whether or not a project can be obligated in the amount of time dictated by the grant's schedule requirements. As previously explained, Section 106 is a critical component of being able to obligate a grant. So we look at how ready you are to complete Section 106 and other environmental review requirements like NEPA. There are some things that you can do in a grant application to demonstrate to FRA that you understand Section 106 as a requirement of grant obligation, and that if selected, you will be ready to complete the Section 106 review process. In the environmental readiness section of your grant application, you should explain to FRA if FRA or another federal agency has or is currently conducting the Section 106 review process for your project. Don't assume that we know this information. As we explained, Section 106 is a federal agency requirement when there is an undertaking that could affect historic properties. As a potential grantee, you should not initiate Section 106 just so you can apply for an FRA grant. However, if your project has already involved FRA or another federal agency because of previous fundings or approvals, your project may have already completed or be in the process of completing Section 106. If this is the case, explain it in the environmental readiness section of your grant application. If there has been no Section 106 consultation for your project, that is totally fine. Just provide FRA with some information to help us determine how long the environmental review process may take. Some of the information that would be helpful regarding Section 106 would be the age of the railroad infrastructure associated with your project, if there are any other resources within or surrounding your project area that are known historic properties. Account for the time it may take to do Section 106 in your project schedule. Explain if you think all or part of your project would qualify as an exempted activity under the Rail Right-of-Way Program comment. Include in your project budget costs for qualified staff to prepare Section 106 review materials. While a potential FRA grantee does not initiate Section 106 consultation in order to apply for a grant, there are, as I mentioned, there are some informal coordination activities that you can do to gather the useful information on historic resources in the environmental readiness section of a grant application. The most useful thing you can do is use online resources to do a preliminary desktop survey of known historic properties that are within your project area. This will not substitute for Section 106 consultation. However, it gives FRA an idea of what we may encounter with your project. The National Park Service is still in the process of digitizing the National Register of Historic Places, and their website is noted on the screen. In the past few years, many state historic preservation offices have developed great online resources to share the information that they have on historic properties. The website on the screen provides the link to all the different SHPO websites. You can also reach out to the State Historic Preservation Officer for informal assistance, but make very clear that you are not initiating Section 106 consultation, but gathering preliminary information for your project development purposes. If a SHPO does not have online resources to search for historic properties, you may ask them to conduct a desktop review of the historic property and archaeological survey records for the project area. You may ask them for recommendations on qualified cultural resource staff that can help you in preparing necessary surveys and documentations that might be required. You can also ask for recommendations on consulting parties, such as historic societies and federally recognized tribes in your area. You can ask what their state-specific requirements are for Section 106 documentation or submission requirements for Section 106 review. It is very important to note that while you may ask the SHPO for this type of assistance, they are not required to provide you with this informal assistance. If they do provide this to you, please acknowledge their generosity and helpfulness because we have not initiated Section 106 consultation at this point yet. Some of the most frequent questions we get from new grantees is how long does the Section 106 process take, and how does this affect obligation of grant funding for a project? Section 106 is not a one-size-fits-all for all projects. Timeframes will vary depending on the type and location of project, the type and number of historic properties involved, whether the project will have adverse effects to historic properties, if there is public or political interest regarding the project, and when in the project planning or design process, FRA receives adequate documentation from the grantee to advance Section 106. Adequate documentation is defined as that which meets SHPO or state standards, is determined by FRA to be legally sufficient under Section 106 regulations, and or addresses FRA documentation needs or requests to verify the appropriate application of the program comment. FRA can provide examples of adequate Section 106 materials if you have questions. Please coordinate this request through your FRA or project manager or your assigned FRA environmental protection specialist. This slide provides the general timeframes specific to Section 106. Please remember that Section 106 is one of many environmental planning laws under the Nepa umbrella that needs to be completed before a grant can be obligated. So this is not representative of an entire environmental review timeline. I hope this slide convinces you to think about Section 106 early in project planning. Again, timeframes are contingent upon receipt of adequate documentation. If the program comment is 100% applicable, Section 106 can typically be completed in less than a month. If Section 106 consultation is required, grantees should factor in 30-day regulatory reviews by the SHPO and relevant consulting parties for every consultation package submission. Some projects will require multiple submissions. If adverse effects are identified and need to be resolved, Grantees should factor in 6 months to 1 year or more in their project planning timelines. Next, we're now in our last portion of the webinar, where I will explain who is responsible for completion of different parts of the Section 106 review process with FRA. Grantees should assist FRA in the Section 106 process, but not complete it on FRA's behalf or independent of FRA. While FRA has historic preservation professionals on staff to help complete the Section 106 review, FRA does not do the Section 106 legwork. Rather, we provide technical direction to grantees and their consultants to manage the Section 106 process. We expect grantees and/or their consultant to do substantive work, such as conducting background research and surveys, preparing reports, agreement documents, etc., that will ultimately be required to complete the Section 106 review. Consider Section 106 early in the planning process to ensure you account for time or costs needed to complete the review. For preliminary engineering / NEPA grants, by their nature, these funds fund environmental reviews, which include Section 106 related work. However, grantees should specifically factor in Section 106 related work into their budgets and schedules in their grant applications. For final design and construction grants, in order for environmental review activities, including Section 106 related work, to be eligible for reimbursement, they must be included in your grant application, and most importantly, in the USDOT FRA approved grant agreement scope of work. Overall, eligible costs may vary by grant or track 1, 2, 3 and/or grant program. Check the Notice of Funding Availability, or NOFO. It includes an FRA point of contact who can answer your questions when you are preparing or before you submit a grant application. Other reminders: you are responsible for preparing all Section 106 materials for FRA's review and approval, including the preparation of letters that will be signed by FRA, and also architectural and archaeological surveys. Other examples are shown on this slide. Use qualified professionals to ensure that you are generating adequate documentation, and ask for FRA's technical assistance if you need it. This is a reminder that FRA is responsible for complying with Section 106, and grantees should assist FRA in meeting this legal obligation. There are certain things that you can and cannot do as a grantee. Do informally coordinate with SHPO to gather information and help prepare Section 106 materials for FRA's review and approval. Do not formally consult with SHPO or federally recognized tribes on FRA's behalf or independent of FRA. FRA has special government-to-government relationships with tribes that cannot be delegated. Do not submit FRA-approved materials to SHPO or tribes on FRA's behalf once authorized by FRA to do so. Do not submit architectural or archaeological reports to SHPOs or tribes until approved and authorized by FRA. As stated previously, grantees are expected to do substantive legwork for a Section 106 review, and you should account for this in your project budget. To ensure timely delivery of project, you should engage qualified Secretary of Interior qualified professionals or consultants to ensure the adequacy of documentation. Using the right people will reduce the level of effort and save time. A qualified professional or consultant should meet the Secretary of Interior's professional qualification standards in architecture, historic architecture, architectural history, archaeology, or another closely related field. In order to be considered SOI qualified, an individual generally has to have an advanced degree in their area of expertise coupled with professional experience. FRA also recommends that an ideally qualified professional or consultant would have Section 106 experience supporting other federal agencies, experience applying the National Register eligibility criteria to railroads and rail infrastructure, have state permits or licenses to conduct fieldwork in your project state, and knowledge of any state-specific requirements, forms, report formats, or survey guidelines or methodology for conducting and documenting cultural resource surveys. Some state historic preservation officers maintain lists and can provide recommendations for qualified consultants. So, what is FRA responsible for? We are responsible for providing technical assistance to grantees, verifying the appropriate application and usage of the program comment rail right-of-way exempted activities list, authorizing grantees to initiate Section 106 consultation, reviewing and approving all Section 106 materials related to defining the area of potential effect, the identification and valuation of historic properties, and effect determinations. This includes reviewing architectural and/or archaeological survey reports. FRA is also responsible for government-to-government consultation with federally recognized Indian tribes. While you may be asked to assist in preparing materials, this government-to-government relationship and consultation is conducted by FRA. FRA is also responsible for making effect determinations and enforcing terms of a memorandum of agreement or programmatic agreement, including monitoring a grantee's implementation of mitigation measures. So hopefully you have picked up on the best practices and common mistakes highlighted throughout this presentation. As a reminder, railroad infrastructure is often subject to Section 106 reviews. Section 106 review is a critical step towards obligation or approval of your grant or project. And Section 106 can have time and implication costs for your project and should be incorporated early into your project planning activities. Ask FRA for technical assistance when you or your consultants have questions. By understanding Section 106 requirements and FRA's grant review process, and through the use of qualified professionals, you can ensure completion of a Section 106 review in a timely and efficient manner. Now we will do one final poll to see what you've learned.
Thanks, Amanda. All right. This question is, grantees or project sponsors are expected to utilize qualified persons to draft Section 106 consultation materials for FRA review and approval. A, true, or B, false? All right, thank you all so much. I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. The answer for that one was true. All right, our next question is, if Section 106 review was completed by FRA or another federal agency for the project you are seeking FRA funding for, should you mention this in the environmental readiness section of a grant application? A, yes, B, no. And you can make your selection by going to the little dot there next to the A, yes, or B, no, and that's how you make your answer selection. All right, thank you so much. And our final question, and the answer for that was yes. The final question is, project sponsors or grantees conduct government-to-government Section 106 consultation with federally federally recognized tribes. A, true, B, false. All right, thank you all so much. much. I'm going to go ahead and end this question. And the answer was B, false. All right, Amanda, back to you.
Thank you. Again, lots of great answers. I think the first question, everybody got that right. But the question about the government-to-government consultation, the reason why that was false is because while project sponsors and grantees can assist with preparing information that's necessary for those consultations, FRA as the federal government is responsible for conducting government-to-government consultations with federally recognized tribes. So if you would like to learn more about Section 106, we encourage you to visit both FRA and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation's websites, which include information about Section 106, the Rail Right-of-Way Program comment, as well as free training opportunities. Some of the links seen here and in the next slide are provided in the Web Resources section of your screen. On this page, these are specifically documents that the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation has prepared. These guidance documents are related to Section 106. Once in a while, ACHP also holds training, and information regarding these opportunities can be found at achp.gov.
All right. Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you all for joining us today for the Section 106 Basics for Potential FRA Grantees webinar. A recording or a video of today's webinar will be available on FRA's website in the next week. The webinar will end in 20 seconds, so please copy or screenshot the contact information on the screen. As a reminder, the presentation file will be available via the FRA's website this afternoon, which you can access via web link 2. And speaking of web links, please note that we will email all web links to you after the webinar. Again, we'll be ending this webinar in about 10 seconds, and thank you so much for joining us.